Joining us today is a veteran in the field of greenhouse gas reporting. Chris Lawless is the head of ESG metrics and disclosure at Cameron Cole, an ADEC innovations company. With a career spanning over 2 decades, Chris brings to our discussion today unparalleled expertise in greenhouse gas management, ESG consulting, and environmental sustainability. His hands-on experience encompasses the entire gamut of greenhouse gas reporting, from inventory development and sustainability reporting to LCAs and inventory verification. Having worked with the California Air Resources Board, Chris has worked with one of the leading governmental bodies that manages and regulates greenhouse gases. Today, he's here to unpack the world of greenhouse gas reporting, including how an organization might get started, a discussion of best practices around Scope 3, and to share his knowledge on the greenhouse gas verification process. Let's jump in. Welcome to the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast, presented by North Star Carbon Management. I'm your host, Chris Barsman. If you're a professional responsible for managing your organization's carbon footprint, this podcast is for you. We bring you expert insights, emerging technologies, and actionable strategies to excel in the complex world of carbon management. Stay tuned for an enlightening conversation and real-world solutions. Let's jump in. All right. This is Christopher Lawless joining us today. Thanks so much, Chris, for being here with us. If you wouldn't mind, let's just jump on in. Tell us a little bit about where you work and the work that you do there, please.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. So I work at a company called Cameron Cole. I've been there for going on 16 years now. And we were, I would say, one of the early actors in sort of the greenhouse gas accounting and verification space. I head up our verification group as well as our metrics and measurement team, and that really includes greenhouse gas inventory work, data heavy sort of ESG elements. But yeah, we're active in really a lot of the major programs for greenhouse gas emissions throughout the US. California, state of California, Oregon, Washington State, do a lot of work sort of for non-programmatic company, verifications as well, where people are verifying against the GHG protocol, disclosing it in their CSR report, as well as, to various indices, CDP, and the like.
Awesome. Yeah, the work that you folks do is super important, and it's definitely very timely, given the recently passed legislation in California. Obviously, a lot of organizations are now going to be moving from optionally reporting their carbon emission inventories to something more of a mandated, depending on how large the organization is. Thinking about folks that are having to create their first initial inventory and maybe haven't gone through the process themselves, I like to ask kind of two questions around this. One, if an organization is trying to start this process, who do you think would be the best person typically within an organization to maybe be assigned this? Do you think that's someone that's in the finance? Is that someone more on their operations side, perhaps? And then the second question of that is, where do they even get started? Where would you kind of push them to kind of kick this off and start go down the path of making this a meaningful report?
Sure. Yeah, happy to speak to that. So, assuming it's a large organization, I think it really needs a team of key individuals that includes, operations. It could be a finance role or sort of an accounting role, and then, individual facility managers, if that's the nature of your organization. But, developing a greenhouse gas inventory really starts with understanding your organizational boundary, what business operations are in. So if you're, a multinational and you have different business divisions, understanding sort of where those lie, understanding the nature of those relationships, whether you have partnerships, whether you have, other things that might roll into your greenhouse gas inventory. But, beyond, just starting with your organizational boundary, you need to sort of define how you're going to do your inventory. And that really starts with either selecting essentially operational control, which is fairly straightforward, or financial control. And for some organizations, that'll get you to the same place. For others, those have vastly different sort of footprints based on how you define that control criteria. Once you've made that decision, it really starts with engaging the people that know your operations best. Maybe it's a COO, maybe it engages, a real estate division. Once you get that organizational boundary defined, you need to sort of understand which sources fall within that boundary. And that's where you want to bring in more of a on the ground operations person to understand, do you have electricity accounts, which you always likely will, natural gas, mobile fleet, some of the smaller sources, whether it's, in process emissions or fugitive emissions. And then, from there, understanding where your data sits and who's the data owner, is it, centrally managed? Is it managed out at individual branches? Understanding where it sits, and then how best to collect it in a manner where you're not manipulating the data. If you can, we have centralized systems where you don't have to key in data, that's great. But it's really sort of a stepwise process, starting at the top and then going all the way down to the activity data level. Activity data could include kilowatt hours, gallons of fuel, items like that.
Yeah, that's great. And obviously that's kind of falls in the scope 1 and the scope 2 aspects of a company's or organization's reporting. As a company starting to consider their scope 3, obviously that's the beast that's very hard to manage. A lot of organizations have started utilizing spend-based methodologies for reporting. What do you think about that as a methodology? And is that maybe a good place to get as like a jumping off point, and then they get a little bit more specific, or kind of share some thoughts and opinions and maybe best practices around how an organization might start to tame the beast, which is scope 3?
Yeah, happy to chime in on that. So, what's key when you start this process for scope 3 is to understand which of the 15 categories are relevant. It could start with a spend-based model, and that'll get you, some insights, particularly with purchased goods and services, capital goods, a few of the smaller, maybe business travel. That won't really inform use of sold product. If that's a relevant category for you, that can be much more complicated. It can be a decent way to start to understand, what's relevant, what's possibly material, but it's really a first step. So if you really want to set goals against scope 3, you need to engage suppliers and understand, basically their scope 1 and 2 emissions and how that sort of flows into your overall scope 3 footprint.
That makes sense. When an organization is starting to jump into those scope 3 and they're looking for resources potentially to maybe find some emission factors, or potentially find best methodologies for approaching it, what have you seen that's been the most successful strategies there?
With a spend-based model, a lot of folks use US EEIO, like US EPA, EEIO. So commodity-based, spend-based factors, eco-invent, those types of things. Those are do a decent job sort of at that screening level. And then, I would say scope 3 at this stage is really almost more of an art than a science, where, there's general guidelines out there from GHG protocol, the technical guidance under scope 3 for GHG protocol does give, sort of point you in the right direction for certain categories. And, there are simple ones, maybe like business travel, employee commuting, those types of things. But it gets much more complicated, especially for a company that has many different services or different sectors that it operates, to really understand, end of life, use of sold products, some of these other categories where there's nothing really available out, right out of the box in terms of methodologies or, standardized approaches.
That makes sense. Yeah. As I understand it, you're an emissions verifier, right? Accredited. When you're looking at inventories from organizations, what are some things that you're looking for to verify, to say, yeah, that the methodology that they've used is reasonable, that the emission sources that they used are correct? How can an organization kind of navigate some of that, knowing that it being a little bit more art than science potentially at this point?
So is this question relevant to scope 3 or to scope 1 and 2?
Let's go. I mean, let's start with scope 1 and 2, since the organization will, and then maybe we can expand a little bit into scope 3 as it makes sense for you.
Sure. So for scope 1 and 2, there's a regulatory context. So let's say the state of California has a very sort of detailed regulatory guidance on what you should do for each individual sector, each source. Largely, they default back to the US EPA GHG reporting rules, the federal reporting rules. And it's prescriptive in terms of your approach and your emission factors and so forth. And as a verifier in a program like that, you're required to ensure that they conform to those requirements. So very little latitude on how you account for emissions in the California program, and really in the context of any mandatory program as well. And even in the voluntary context, there's a high level of specificity for certain voluntary programs like the climate registry. There's a general reporting protocol. There's their own set of default emission factors. And as a verifier, you need to ensure that they basically conform to what's in those documents. So that's sort of one scenario under scope 1 and 2. And then secondarily, there's voluntary reporters that generally report against the GHG protocol. That as a guidance document is honestly rather vague. And there is more latitude, as a reporter and as a verifier to say that it conforms to the GHG protocol. It doesn't say you need to account for, sources in a certain way with a certain method. There's more latitude with emission factors as well. Larger corporate reporters that just voluntarily disclose their emissions to say CDP or in a CSR report, there's more flexibility there, honestly. So that's really the scope 1 and 2 buckets. Scope 3, sort of as I indicated earlier, there's even less guidance out there. There are some commonly used methods for some of the ones I touched on earlier, where many people use spend-based model for with dollars and those factors that I mentioned, and that's a fairly straightforward reporting and verification process, as long as you can substantiate the dollars going into those models. Sometimes that's centrally managed and easy to verify. Sometimes it's decentralized, and understanding how that spend data flows in, whether you're capturing all business units, how you deal with credits back and reconciliations. Some of that might be part of the verification, something we look at for those categories in scope 3.
Gotcha. So what I'm hearing is it has a lot to do with making sure that making sure that they're being complete with their inventory, that they're trying to be as accurate as possible, that they're providing transparency. I think those are kind of some underlying features that you're always looking for when you're evaluating the inventory itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some of the principles of GHG accounting. And as an auditor, you always look for a good audit trail. Let's say you get a spreadsheet, you hate to see sort of a hard-coded number that doesn't tie back to a bigger data set. If it's aggregating a total for, let's say, a variety of accounts, you want to see where all that data comes from in as much granularity as possible. So as an auditor, you want to see those monthly invoice amounts, those, let's say, electricity consumption values by month. And as an auditor, we would take some of that data and trace it back to an invoice. And having that sort of in place already is really key when going into an audit. Another tool we like to see is an inventory management plan that details a lot of what we've touched on here, where it says, here's my organizational boundary, here are my operations. Oftentimes there are known exclusions. So we know we couldn't get, refrigerant data from our, factory in India. So we know that's out. And oftentimes you need to prompt reporters to tell you what's out. And that's not always documented, but it's important to see that. And then essentially sort of a roadmap to how you did your inventory, what assumptions were made, what emission factors you used, and basically, sort of something that takes you all the way through the lowest activity data and all the way up to, your boundaries as an organization.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And kind of pulling off of that, if an organization is caught between two places of let's use that example of our factory in India, we don't know their refrigeration. Do you find that it's more common practice for an organization to exclude, or do you find it's more common practice for an organization to create estimates around maybe some industry standards or some industry estimates that they might be fined? What is your recommendation if an organization is kind of faced with that question or that situation?
Yeah, it definitely can be a challenge in, initial years to get a complete inventory, and you sort of have to make a judgment call. I do see a mix of some organizations that make estimates versus some that exclude. There are some estimation methods for electricity based on intensity factors, natural gas that have intensity factors against square footage, where they're defensible, they're sort of accepted. And there are other sort of estimation methods that really aren't verifiable or defensible. Those are the ones I would stay away from, where I've seen layers of assumptions. So let's assume this restaurant has this type of equipment and has this type of capacity, and it's just not verifiable, and I don't think very meaningful. So unless you can really tie it back to some activity data source like square footage or some bit of reality, I would exclude it entirely. If it's a missing month and you have, January and March and you don't know February, filling in that gap with preceding and a month following, that makes sense. But just completely layering in assumptions to say that you're complete is something you should stay away from, especially if you're disclosing that to stakeholders or trying to build or establish goals that are reliant on these sources that are basically not verifiable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good thing to hear, because a lot of times organizations want to be as complete as possible, but the recognition that sometimes it might be better to exclude versus making grand assumptions might be a strong way to think about it. Obviously, as long as they disclose that exclusion is happening. So that's helpful to think about it that way. Scope 2 is one that I always find that's a little bit interesting in terms of when people are thinking about market versus location-based data. When an organization is reporting and they're choosing to report market versus location-based, and obviously, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you generally have to report both ways. When an organization is trying to build this part of their inventory, are there any strategies that you'd recommend that they pursue to make sure that the information is accurate and to make sure that they're including meaningful data, that it doesn't miss the actual activity that's underlying?
So for to be compliant with the GHG protocol, you're required to do dual reporting for location-based and market-based. And market-based really reflects your purchasing decisions, who you're buying power from. Are you electing to, opt into a green power program? Are you purchasing, renewable energy credits? Those types of things. So there's essentially, and for some organizations, it's possible that they could be identical, essentially, your location-based and market-based. But there's essentially a hierarchy of sort of methodologies for the emission factors of the approach for market-based. I would say the most accurate is reflecting power purchase agreements. Again, if you're applying unbundled renewable energy credits, those sort of layer in. There's a green E residual mix factor, which I'm getting into the weeds a bit here, but basically nets out renewable energy purchases by other parties and has an emission factor based on the e-grid emission factor that is more reflective of what's left in the market. Technically slightly more accurate than just a location-based emission factor for market-based.
And this is something I always, sometimes struggle with myself as I'm working with companies on scope 2. I'm an organization. I create 100 kilowatts, or I utilize 100 megawatts of power. 20% of that is on-site generation. How do I apply that through both the location and market prism?
So if it's, let's say, on-site generation for, let's say, a natural gas turbine, that's already captured under your scope 1, it should be anyway. So that would not be part of your scope 2. Oftentimes there's, let's say, on-site solar generation, and there's a little bit of nuance there, depending on who owns the panels, the sort of essentially who owns the environmental attributes of the electricity being generated, and how it's metered into your facility, whether it goes back to the grid versus direct feed. So there is some nuance there to sort of unpack where it goes, but it should be, let's say, the PV scenario should be accounted for appropriately based on where that energy flows.
Okay, so you're saying if we own it and it flows directly into my organization, then that would just very quickly reduce my market-based emissions. But if it flows back into the grid, then we need to talk about how I'm purchasing the energy back. That might include some of those offsets or some of that generation.
Yes. So basically, if it's a direct feed into your facility, obviously that should drive down your own, let's say you had your own consumption, whether it be additional purchases of electricity or use of your scope 1 sort of generation unit. You should see those reductions, and it should be directly shown as basically a reduction of your consumption for those other sources of power.
Makes sense. Kind of going in a little bit different direction here. When an organization conducts their greenhouse gas inventory and they complete it, have you found that they're finding benefits beyond just what they learn within their carbon footprint from the process of doing that? And if so, what are some of those benefits, and how can an organization tap into those?
Yeah, I definitely think there are co-benefits depending on how organized the company is itself. Over the years, I've been surprised at, working with some very large multinational companies. And this is probably more years ago than maybe current day, where some organizations don't even have a handle on how many locations they have, where those locations are, what they're doing at those locations. So, understanding your organization is, a clear benefit from that. And as people sort of move further along in their management of data and some of the data required for inventory development, I've seen, companies take on better utility management software systems, getting better data, understanding, consumption at these locations. And all of that's very key as we sort of move into, a phase where many more companies are establishing goals, trying to make real reductions and see those reductions. So, better measurement, better monitoring, and then hopefully more progress towards, achieving emission reductions.
Yeah, and that's something I always like to highlight with folks that I'm working with, is just that, not everyone wants to do their carbon reporting. They find that they're obligated to. And I find that speaking to some of those benefits beyond just the inventory itself of how it's going to help their operations, how it's going to help them gain a lot of business insight, convinces them that it's probably a better decision than just the we got to do this thing to check the box. So
Yeah,
I appreciate you kind of diving into that a little bit.
sure.
I know that I think that if I'm not mistaken, you've kind of developed some carbon offset projects. Am I correct on that?
So we have been involved as a verifier on primarily the California Air Resources Board project types, and there's a couple that we've specialized in, the ozone depleting substance destruction and livestock projects.
Wow. Okay. When an organization is considering a carbon offset project, and obviously carbon offsets are a little bit of a hot button topic right now. Curious to get your opinion onto whether or not it should be a hot button topic. What are some strategies an organization might want to consider when they're considering carbon offsets, or should they be considering them in the first place? And just kind of wander down that path a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, definitely a hot button topic. Just reading a very interesting article about forestry offsets last night, and I honestly would probably stay away from the voluntary market if I were a corporate reporter looking to achieve emission reductions potentially through offsets. I would consider not doing that at this time. I think always, the best approach is to look at ways to actually reduce your footprint through modifications of your operations. And that could take a whole host of forms. It could be, fuel switching. It could be, getting more green power. Many different sort of pathways to that. So yeah, I would stay away from the voluntary market in forestry, sort of in particular. I think within California's program, and that's a program that we operate, it is a robust program, and I feel like there's a lot of checks and balances. The two project types that we work in, it's a more physical sort of scenario rather than, let's say, forestry trying to figure out, a baseline of deforestation on a forestry project. We're looking at, paper records, let's say on an ODS project, where you really see the sort of transfer of custody of these gases and a record of destruction, and it's real, it's quantifiable. You can put your hands on it, you can see it. Similarly on the livestock project front, you can go and get records on the number of cows and see the digester and see the electricity that's generated from the biogas. And I think there are worthwhile projects still out there, and those are a couple of them.
If an organization wanted to be a part of those projects, is that something that would be available to an organization, or is that I'm not too familiar with those projects myself? So is that something very specific to the state of California and them trying to reduce the state's emissions, or is that something that people can buy into?
So there are a handful of project types that essentially within California's cap and trade program, a small percentage of the emission reductions for an organization can be met through purchase of these offsets. It is a rather small component of the overall sort of cap and trade program, and those offsets, those metric ton offsets, could be purchased for someone that's not subject to the compliance obligations of California's program. So being someone acquiring those offsets, yeah, that certainly can be done. As somebody outside of California or outside of being a regulated entity.
That's fascinating. And maybe potentially with the organizations you've worked with, have you seen, I think sometimes people think of offsets as a quick and easy, cheap way to, okay, I'm going to write down my number. When we're talking about these more meaningful ones that you can see and touch and feel, do you find that organizations are better set to look at those kind of options, or do you think they're better set to maybe think about capital improvements, or so that they can make fuel switches, or invest in more on-site production of energy and renewable energy? Have you seen some of that cost benefit play out, and have you seen any potentially strategies that have been more cost benefit valuable to an organization?
Sure. I think that the real path to getting to net zero or really becoming carbon neutral as an organization, it really has to be, operational changes. And there are challenges. Certain sectors are easier than, others. An organization that's primarily a scope two sort of footprint, pretty easy to achieve, carbon neutrality, given you have the resources and so forth. Um, but there are sectors, that are much more challenging, waste being one of them. You're taking in municipal waste, it's degrading in a landfill, and not a lot of options, on sort of removing those emissions at this time. So definitely some challenges in certain sectors. Um, you know, I think the public and sort of stakeholders desire to just see that you're, purchasing these carbon offsets, I think is declined quite a bit. So I think credibility with your customers, with your stakeholders, is important. So I don't think using offsets at this point in time is how you want to, be the primary mechanism for you sort of reducing your emissions.
Makes a ton of sense. That's helpful. Again, kind of going in a slightly different direction. Now I'm thinking a little bit more about scope three and purchase goods and services, suppliers. Have you seen any strategies organizations have engaged in to engage their suppliers to, one, help them report their emissions back to them so that they're a little bit more accurate in terms of the reporting, and two, to engage them to help them reduce their emissions so that they in turn reduce their own emissions as well?
Yeah, we're definitely starting to see more of that in the marketplace. This past year, we worked with some suppliers to Microsoft that essentially Microsoft circulated basically a disclosure requirement to their suppliers to report scope one, scope two, and I think it was scope three categories. Um, so there's definitely activity there. I believe Amazon's in the process of doing something similar, where these very large companies, those are the ones that on the earliest stage have the ability to move the needle. It is honestly the additional expense in time and money to for these companies, and some of them are rather small, to do this accounting exercise, but it has to be done. And I do think these bigger companies are going to be, driving their suppliers to, have to achieve emission reductions. And it's happening now. And honestly, it's quite exciting to see these types of activities. I've been in the space for, 15 plus years, 25 as a consultant. And boy, has it taken a lot longer to get where we're at now than I'd hoped when I sort of went down this pathway, but it's very exciting. I'm seeing, a lot of positive things happening. There's going to be legal challenges along the way. I think we all see it, we acknowledge it, which is unfortunate, but I think we're really starting to see some progress here.
And do you think this progress, I'm coming from a place of hope and that when I ask this question of, do you see this progress as coming from, okay, it's legislatively, it's being pushed and people are having to do this? Or do you find that it's more a groundswell from both consumers and also businesses understanding that there's some value to this process?
Yeah, I don't know if it's one thing. Maybe I'm a little jaded. I do think a lot's happening because it's driven by money, by investors. I've seen a lot of activities where asset managers and very powerful and big companies see as a risk. They see a risk for actual operations, a risk to disruption of the supply chain, and investors, as we have an evolving sort of SEC guidance. It's a risk for people investing in their retirement, and so a lot of it's being driven by risk. Unfortunately, a lot of it's not being driven at the federal level. I am going to toot California's horn a bit, and they've been doing good work for a long time now, and I think that could be a real blueprint for the federal level. Probably not going to get there, given where we're at the with political discourse at the federal level, but yeah, money's moving things, and would have been nice if there were other things moving it, but I'll take what I can get.
Yeah, no, I mean that's fair, and I think to your point, the California law, doing business in California is something that a lot of people want to do,
Yeah.
and it's going to be, and that's going to be really drive this conversation forward, and that's where again I'd really try to help people see some of the ancillary benefits of this process. To your point, like I've worked with an organization, literally found sites that they didn't realize existed. It's like, oh, really? We operate there? Okay, and it's like, I did not know this. So yeah, no, very insightful. Before I jump into some of my closing questions, any other topics that you think are valuable to a listener that might be that you wanted to jump into?
Yeah, I mean, I've just have maybe a PSA here to say, yeah, don't wait. If you're an organization that's saying, I'm going to wait until the SEC tells me exactly what to do, or I'm going to sit back and wait until I have to do things, I think it's a mistake. I think it takes time to get, a good greenhouse gas inventory. Honestly, takes, years for larger, more complex organizations to get good data flowing into these calculations, to get a real handle on your footprint, establishes processes and procedures that ensure an audit trail, verifiable data, and yeah, so that's it. I would say don't sit around and wait, and if you've taken the first step or reported your inventory, it's time to get it verified. It's time to see where you stand and whether it is auditable. And a lot of people are disclosing this data, so there's a lot of risk in if you don't sort of know exactly what you have and what you're reporting on. And especially as we move towards goal setting, honestly, goals are meaningless unless you have a verified baseline.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And just to jump off that one more little bit is, if an organization, I'm a small business, medium-sized business, few employees, dozen employees, where do I get started?
So if you have a very simple organization, GHG protocol has some GHG calculator tools, essentially Microsoft Excel workbooks, plug and play, easy to do. The GHG protocol is also available on the same site. Will get you sort of rolling. But yeah, that's a good place to get started for a simple organization. For a larger one, unless you have the internal expertise, you really need to reach out to a consulting firm to really start this process, especially given where we're at and where we're going is you need to get moving soon.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to your point of start now and don't delay, there's probably not enough consultants to go around once this becomes something mandatory for everyone. So I think that's a valuable piece of advice for people to hear. All right, well, right now we'll jump into some of our closing questions with you. These are questions that we ask all of our guests. They're meant to be quick hitters, and just to provide some extra insight for our listeners. So first question, are there any newsletters, websites, or maybe other online resources, or maybe professional organizations you'd recommend that folks in the industry consider following or subscribing to?
I'll do a plug for our parent company's website and newsletter. So ADEC ESG Green Watch is a good way to get I can't remember, it's probably monthly newsletter with some good articles and insights on some of the things we're talking about, and then also beyond greenhouse gas accounting, broader sustainability news and initiatives.
Awesome. Have you been to any good events or conferences, or are you a part of any organizations that you'd recommend people to look into or consider?
Sure. I've been going to Navigating the American Carbon World conference for 16, 17 years now. That's always a good one. More of a carbon market sort of focus conference. The Climate Registries, Climate Leadership Conference, if you're looking for sort of GHG accounting and understanding what other organizations are doing, that could be a good one, smaller conference. And I think as many probably recommend, Green Biz, if you're looking for a broader sustainability ESG conference where, many of the big players will be, that's a good one too.
Awesome. Have you ever found a surprising or unconventional data source that people have used in their carbon accounting? Is there anything that's particularly interesting?
Yeah, as an auditor, I don't think we like surprising or unusual. When you're verifying something, you want to see that it's, generally speaking, there are methodologies for the vast number of sources that are out there. Occasionally, we have, run across, I think it was maybe black carbon manufacturing emissions. There was maybe a couple sources that were not really outlined. But yeah, we've seen it all. There's a lot of good guidance out there. Sometimes you have to dig a little harder to find it. But there's generally good GHG methodologies and emission factors at this stage for scope 1 and 2. Scope 3, really sort of a different story. And honestly, that's evolving and really needs to evolve quicker. And yeah, I definitely would like to be sort of a part of that process on the scope 3 side.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So if I can take away on that, don't be too creative with your emission sources. stick to the beaten path to help with the auditing process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Don't get too creative because you might not pass verification.
Have you seen any fun, interesting, inventive ways that an organization has engaged their stakeholders to reduce their carbon footprint?
Well, it might be a stretch to call it fun and interesting, but there are, on the scope 3 side, folks incentivize or companies incentivize, public transit or carpooling or certain business travel initiatives. I don't know that they're fun or creative, and honestly, those sources tend to be small on the smaller side, on the scope 3 side. But sadly, with scope 1 and 2, it takes some work to get and to achieve emission reductions, and it takes a real plan. And that starts with sort of understanding your data, getting a good data set, and then mapping and modeling and doing quantitative analysis to figure out which option, which scenario makes sense for achieving reductions for your various sources.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last one, and I think we kind of touched on it with the PSA and what you just said right there, but if there's only one thing that our guests take away from this conversation, what do you think it should be?
Well, I said, don't wait. I guess my other one would be write everything down. So the more documentation you have in terms of how you've established your greenhouse gas inventory, as an example, the better for traceability, auditability, year over year reportability, and ensuring that you're using the same methods, you're accounting for things in the same way. Super important as we sort of move into a more regulated world for some organizations. Some are already there, in California and in other places. But yeah, having a good management plan, it's really key. There's, we'll see a lot of turnover for staff preparing inventories without that documentation that can stand on its own. There's risks to the organization on getting it right.
That makes sense. No, that's great. That's great insight. And, again, so important for organizations to remember to your point, write everything down. It's the second year I find that organizations start being like, oh, shoot, where did we get that? How did we do that? What was our assumptions? That makes a ton of sense. Last question, and I think we touched on it a little bit. Where can our listeners go to find out more about you, more about the work that your organization is doing?
Sure. Yeah. You can check out Cameron-Cole.com and also Google ADEC ESG, and that'll bring you to our webpage for our broader ESG services for our parent company.
Awesome. Well, Chris Lawless, thank you so much for your time today. Really insightful, ton of great information that I think our listeners will be able to take away from. So thank you again for your time today.
Of course, yeah, great chat with you. Appreciate it.
This brings us to the end of another lightning episode here at the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and that you're walking away with new ideas and actionable strategies. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our latest episode. We also encourage you to join the conversation by rating this episode and sharing your comments and ideas with our community. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we encourage you to email us at podcast@northstarcarbon.com. On behalf of myself, your host, Chris Barsman, and the entire North Star Carbon Management team, thank you for investing your time with us today. Until next time.